On August 20th, 2021, Andrew Travnicek died doing what he loved, and that's flying. We're going to take a look at the video and talk about the NTSB final report and lessons learned and honor Andy's memory. But before I hit play, I have to warn you that this footage may be tough to watch for some viewers. This was a very tragic loss, and I know there are some people out there that might have an issue with me titling this video, "Pilot Died Doing What He Loves." But I want you to know that that was what his family and friends said about him. Now, I don't know Andy personally, but we both graduated from the United States Air Force Academy, and while he was there, he was a glider instructor, and after he graduated, he went to pilot training at NGEPT, and that's at Shepherd Air Force Base. He served for 20 years in the Air Force, where he flew the C-21, the C-5, the T-34C Turbo Mentor with the U.S. Navy, the T-6 Texan II, and the MC-12. After retiring from the Air Force, he became a pilot for JetBlue, and in his spare time, he flew the North American SNJ-2 Texan. This was the naval variant of the T-6 that was primarily used as a trainer for pilots during World War II and into the 1970s. However, today it remains a popular warbird for airshow demonstrations and static displays, and that's what Andy was doing. He was flying one of these as part of the GEICO Skytypers team, and they were doing a practice run prior to an airshow that they were scheduled to perform in. The team has 6 of these aircraft, and they have a smoke system on board that they use for air shows and creating messages in the sky. Now let's go back to the video, and I'm not going to play this all the way through to the crash, but I just want to point out a few things. All 6 aircraft are taking off in pairs separated by about 15 seconds, and this is the first section of aircraft on the initial departure. As the camera pans back to the left, Andy is the number 3 aircraft, and he's leading this second section of aircraft. And according to the NTSB report, when his wingman, the number 4 aircraft, is joining up on him, normally Andy would be looking out to monitor that rejoin and make sure his wingman's gear was up, but instead, the pilot in the number 4 aircraft noticed that Andy wasn't looking outside and that Andy's aircraft was starting to decelerate. He heard Andy say on the radio that he's got an emergency, and listen to the sound his aircraft makes right before it starts turning to the left, because we're going to talk more about that later. As Andy's aircraft rolled through about 20 degrees of bank, it slowed even further and the bank angle increased until it just became too much to recover. And if you recall seeing some smoke coming from the plane before he hit the ground, that was actually from the smoke generator system they use and not from the engine. And I don't have any personal experience flying this type of aircraft, but I talked to a friend of mine that has about 100 hours flying the SNJ-2, and he said that if you have an engine failure on takeoff, it requires a very swift and aggressive unload in order to keep it flying. But I want to walk through this because I think there's a little bit more to consider in this situation. This is a diagram of the airfield, and they're departing from runway 4. As they get airborne, they're only about 100 feet or so above the ground, and he crashed here off the side of the taxiway. So that means he's starting his turn somewhere past this intersecting runway, and the only reason that I bring this up is because in the NTSB report, they talk about how perhaps he was trying to land on that intersecting runway. We've talked about engine failure on takeoff on this channel a lot, and I've made a few videos talking about the impossible turn. Now, if you're in this situation where you lose an engine and you're only about 100 feet above the ground, you don't really have a lot of options. Ideally, you'd have enough runway out in front of you to just fly the aircraft back down and land. If not, most aircraft operating handbooks will warn you that you shouldn't try to turn back around and land on the runway that you just departed from, because that's usually going to require a very steep angle of bank. And you can see on this chart how when you increase your bank, your stall speed is going to increase exponentially. And that's why pilots are taught, and it's always recommended, just pick a spot somewhere ideally within about 10 to 20 degrees of your nose and just set it down. Now, the problem with this airport is you have a significant change in the elevation right off the departure end of the runway with all these hills in the terrain, and there really isn't anywhere to go. But one thing that the NTSB report doesn't mention is that this runway has something called an E-mass at the departure end. This is an engineered material arresting system, and it's currently installed at 121 runway ends at 71 airports in the US, where there just isn't enough room for a typical runway safety area off the end of the runway. And this is what all these little squares are here in the satellite image. This is crushable material that aircraft tires can sink into, and it helps stop an airplane that overruns the end of the runway. The airport remarks indicate there's a precipitous drop off of each end of this runway, and you can see the EMAS listed here in the other remarks. And I'm not trying to even suggest or speculate that Andy should have tried for the EMAS, because the NTSB didn't even mention this as a possibility, but I did want to point it out because some pilots might not even be aware that the airport that they fly in and out of have this system, and you might end up needing it someday. I think one reason Andy starts the left-hand turn is because he wants to break out of the formation and get away from his wingman. And I know that when you're leading the section and you say on the radio that you have an emergency, the wingman should know to get out of the way if he needs to. But with the wingman being on the right-hand side and joining up with some closure, if Andy starts to turn to the right, he's going to turn into him, and it's not going to give him many options. And so I think that's why he goes to the left instead. Just remember though, an airplane can stall at any speed. All it takes is for you to exceed the critical angle of attack, and the report stated that the accident airplane's stall speed was around 74 miles per hour in a clean configuration, meaning the gear and the flaps are retracted. And I mentioned this chart earlier, but look at these numbers in the mishap report. At 45 degrees of bank, the stall speed increases about 20%. At 60 degrees, it increases by about 40% to 104 miles per hour, and at 75 degrees bank, it's 144 miles per hour, which is more than your climb speed and almost double your wings level stall speed. I don't think Andy was trying the impossible turn, but I wanted to share these numbers to highlight how difficult it can be to keep the aircraft flying if you're trying to turn around after losing an engine. Now that being said, let's talk about what happened to the engine. According to the NTSB, the day before the accident, the pilot reported an issue with the left magneto that he identified during a magneto check. The director of maintenance did some troubleshooting and discovered popping and banging while operating on the left magneto, so he did some work on it, and he did an engine run-up, a magneto check, and a P-lead check with no anomalies. On the day of the mishap, Andy didn't report any anomalies during the engine run-up prior to taking off. However, during the post-accident examination of the wreckage, the left magneto couldn't be rotated due to impact damage, but its coil, when tested, was within operating limits. However, the right magneto rotated easily, consistent with poor magnetism, would not perform at low RPM, and would not fire on all points until it reached 180 RPM. Unfortunately, the post-impact fire precluded a more thorough examination of all the components and the wiring, and the NTSB concluded that it's possible that the loss of engine power occurred due to an undiagnosed fault with the ignition system, which could have been compounded by the poor performing right magneto, and that's probably why you're hearing that popping and banging as the aircraft starts that left-hand turn. And in this scenario, I think Andy just didn't have very many options. And you can brief and talk about emergency scenarios all day long, but until something like this happens to you, you don't know how you're going to react. And my thoughts and prayers are with Andy's family. And if you found this debrief helpful, then be sure to check out another video on the screen here, and I'll see you next time on Pilot Debrief.